Sandy 3 and 4, come in and hose them down one more time, particularly just north of the down pilot.
Roger, Sandy 1. We've got the down pilot in sight. We're coming in from your 6 o'clock at this time.
And we've got quite a bit of ground fire out here, so until we exactly pinpoint it, we're going to have to... Okay, Don, I think we can go for it. This is just small arms. We can move him in along the ridge line. Okay, babes, let me know I'm coming in.
Hello, gunfighter A2 Alpha. A2 Alpha, Sandy 1.
7-4, please.
Okay, bravo. Pop your smoke, pop your smoke. Okay, Charlie, 10 degrees more right, 10 degrees more right. Smoke straight ahead, smoke straight ahead.
Charlie 5-6, Sandy 1, go.
Right, Sandy, they want you to pull back to the west. They got some...
Charlie 3-0, I'm over position now. Breaking right. Okay, Charlie, 10 degrees more right, 10 degrees more right. Smoke straight ahead, smoke straight ahead. Hello, Charlie 3-0, this is Sandy 1 on Victor. Let's get up. We got him up. Coming up. I got him up, please. Coming up.
Let's get the out of here.
The Skyraider is a brute, a hulk, big, a bulky body, long, wide, straight wings, and just one powerful engine, the same engine used on the B-29 bomber. That big engine allowed the plane to carry freakish weapons loads, more than the World War II B-17 bomber, and 4 times the ordnance on the P-51 Mustang. Not all missions lasted this long, but the A-1 could stay aloft for as long as 10 hours, and thanks to those long, wide wings, could maneuver at low speeds. To protect the pilots, extra steel plating was added to the cockpit area. The Skyraider was nicknamed the Spad after the French World War I fighter that was flown by many American pilots. Eddie Rickenbacker became an ace and Medal of Honor recipient flying the Spad over France and Germany. The Skyraider first established itself in combat in 1950 in the Korean War, attacking rail yards, factories, and protecting troops on the ground. Even with great pilots flying a great airplane, there are always losses, men and planes. In Korea, 128 A-1s and many crews were lost. Next came Vietnam. The Navy Spads flew in the very first attack on North Vietnam, August 5th, 1964, from aircraft carriers in the Tonkin Gulf. The targets were fuel depots at Vinh. The Air Force also flew the Spad in various roles in Vietnam. They hunted truck convoys on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They flew close air support and dramatic life-saving Sandy missions, they were called, flying cover for rescues of threatened and injured troops on the ground. Again, there were losses in Vietnam. 266 A-1 Spads and 144 pilots were lost. The Navy's last Vietnam missions were in 1968. The Air Force continued to fly the Spad until the war ended. The Skyraiders retired now. Some say it was the most effective ground support aircraft ever.
a carrier-based dive bomber and torpedo plane, the Skyraider evolved into one of the most versatile aircraft ever deployed by the U.S. military. The Skyraider's ability to carry a wide assortment of weapons made it a devastating ground attack aircraft. This plane stayed around long enough to be 3 planes. It was initially the BT-2D, then it was the AD, and then it was the A-1.
It was such a success that the only major criticism leveled at it was that not enough were built. The first Douglas Skyraider, known then as the Destroyer II, took off in March 1945, beginning a service career that was to stretch, unbroken, to Vietnam. After the last U.S. Navy A-1 combat missions were full, the plane was still being used ashore by the United States and South Vietnamese Air Forces. Where or when the last Skyraider in combat service flew a mission is somewhat of a mystery. It's probable that they were in use in the African state of Chad as recently as 1979. Even as the Skyraider was in development, it was already widely believed to be obsolete. After all, it was designed and constructed at the same time as the development of jet engine aircraft, in an era that was obsessed with speed. While other designers were scratching their heads about the best way to get around the sound barrier, Douglas engineers were wrestling old-fashioned problems with propellers, radial engines. Nobody questioned that the design was a pinnacle of piston-powered aviation, but many questioned the need for climbing that pinnacle. In hindsight, it can be seen that the Skyraider was the sum of an enormous bank of knowledge built up over time. In 1925, just 20 years before the first flight of the Skyraider, the U.S. Navy had 1 aircraft carrier. By 1935, this figure had only increased to 4. Naval aviation was an experimental area. There was no debate about the use and worth of these big ships, but the navies of the world still assessed each other's strength in the number and caliber of battleship guns deployed. Through the 20s and 30s, the numbers of ships and planes slowly increased. Experimentation and testing went a long way toward sorting out the systems, methods, and value of naval aviation. The increasing sophistication and expertise of the crews soon demonstrated telling points in the debate about the function and worth of carriers. It became evident to many that the future of naval conflict would be dominated by air power. Pearl Harbor not only settled all arguments from the die-hard battleship supporters. In the Pacific, it also settled the matter in a practical way. For the moment, the only American force of real power capable of action was the carriers. At the outbreak of war, the carrier complements were, as usual, in transition. It was a major turning point in aviation, with monoplanes taking over from the trusty biplanes. As war started, the planes in use were quickly shown to have major flaws. War demanded different specifications. Fortunately, the conflict in Europe gave a short but significant lead time to aircraft designers, and production was already underway on new, more effective planes. British Helldivers and Grumman Avengers were to carry the bulk of the weight of war for the U.S. ships. These followed the established pattern of 2-seat dive bombers and 3-seat torpedo bombers. The Helldiver, ordered in 1939 and first flown in 1940, became the standard Navy dive bomber of the last 2 years of the war. But throughout its career it was troublesome and displayed several flaws. Among these were instability, an operational range of only 250 miles,
and poor maintenance access. The plane had not lived up to expectation as a load carrier or for its short takeoff ability. But the Helldivers were the best planes available for the job, and they were used to good effect. On the other hand, the Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers were a great success. The planes they were to replace, the aging Douglas Devastators, were so outdated that the Avengers were ordered to full production even before the prototype flew. The gamble paid off. With a 2,000-pound bomb or torpedo load, the Avengers, when they went into service, were invaluable, and they were to stay with the fleet until 1954. Another message was also loud and clear. The layout of attack and bomber aircraft had become outdated. The speed and firepower of fighters was such that there was no way for bombers to protect themselves. Their gunners were no deterrent to fighter attack. They needed to depend on their own fighter escorts for control of the sky. This meant there was no real point in the wasted weight of revolving gun turrets. The load would be better carried as fuel and bombs. Naval aviation was clearly one of the most powerful weapons at America's disposal, and plans were developing to meet needs far beyond the war's era. New, reliable, and powerful engines were available. Experience made it possible to predict accurately the behavior of a designed shape. Combat indicated that the gunner was a redundant concept, and, in the same way, the observer or bombardier was wasted in a specialized airframe. The next specification for a Navy attack plane to be issued was for a single-seat aircraft. Douglas had been working on their submission, the BTD-1, from 1942, but it was clear that the plane, essentially a pre-war design, was no match for its competitors, including the formidable Martin AM-1. While war went on, the situation came to a head on the 16th of June 1944, at a meeting between the heads of the Douglas team and Navy representatives. In their hotel, overnight, he and two assistants, working on the basis of the knowledge they had gained in the years since designing the VTD, came up with the outlines for a new plane. The sketches they presented the next morning, accompanied by their technical explanation, intrigued and impressed the Navy's representatives. Douglas was, in effect, allowed to re-enter the competition. They had only 9 months to get their plane into the air, and it had to comply with very tight and unforgiving specifications. It was, in fact, 9 months and 1 day, 1 day late to its first flight. About an hour after takeoff, the test pilot was back on the ground, enthusiastic about the plane. It had exceeded his expectation, as it was to exceed the expectations of many people during its lifetime. Wartime contracts for 548 planes were canceled. 3 were delivered in 1945, and only another 22 in 1946.
But this minimal production saved the Skyraider.
Though the future of a piston-engine aircraft seemed questionable, this plane was clearly something to be reckoned with. And in 1947, the Navy purchased 239 in 3 different versions. In time, the new plane would operate in many other roles: ambulance, ECM platform, RPV or drone directed, target towed, anti-submarine warfare aircraft, night fighter plane, rescue helicopter escort, early warning radar platform, and even as a transport seating 12 passengers. In all, there were to be around 30 major types, and about the same number of subtypes. The Skyraider never ran out of uses.
The AD-2 was a very stable aircraft. It was not difficult to fly. In fact, to check out in going from one plane to another, going from training command where I flew Corsairs to the A-2, merely read the handbook and took open book tests and sat in the cockpit and learned the location of everything. And then it was time to go. Very quick and a lot of fun. The AD-2 was a good plane to land on a carrier. I went on one full cruise of 6 months and never got a wave off. And I was not the exception. It was just a neat plane on a carrier. When I was a young pilot, I even took off with the flaps up by mistake. Still got airborne. It was just fine.
Korea saw Skyraiders thrown into conflict, where they played a major part in that war. Korea brought the world's remaining ideological camps into conflict. Remnants of the 1930s school of dictators would be swept under the skirts of one camp or the other for the next 40 years, and history would come to see the Cold War as a continuation of the Second World War. But the new American technologies of war pitted against infantry armed with rifles and trenches. The helicopter became a major weapon. The United Nations air domination was, for most of the war, complete. The services of Korea's giant neighbor, China, effectively replaced North Korean forces because these had been destroyed. Jets were deployed, but their need for long straight runways hampered their effectiveness, especially in the frantic early days of the war, as the North Koreans swept the peninsula, captured all but the tiny pocket around Busan. The Air Force was hampered by having to fly from Japan with relatively short-range jets. The Navy's carriers were called on for a high proportion of support for the soldiers fighting desperately to hang on. Skyraiders are essentially a big fighter plane. They don't have an internal bomb bay. It was reasoned that strengthened wings with multiple mounts would accommodate a greater range of stores packages. In fact, the Skyraiders would carry at one time or another the whole inventory, including weapons that were rumors or theories in 1944 when the plane was first drawn up. During the Korean War, Skyraiders took part in highly secret experiments carrying nuclear weapons, and later, in 1953, the AB-4D variant would be developed specifically for that purpose, but it would never be called on to deliver these weapons. It would make and polish its enduring reputation with a range of conventional stores. In the desperate days early in the Korean War, and later as the fighting dragged on, the Skyraiders were increasingly accepted as being the Navy's big punch. Their varied loads were delivered precisely and effectively, and could include rockets and napalm, and a range of small and large bombs to suit particular targets. Their loads had one other outstanding feature. They were enormous. On several occasions, a Skyraider would deliver a weight of bombs that was greater than its own weight. Loads of up to 14,000 pounds were carried in a plane that weighed only 11,000 pounds. This was well outside the parameters of what could be expected from most other aircraft in service, and the longer the war went on, the more additional orders flowed into the Douglas factory. The orders had in fact been stockpiling due to delays in delivery. There was a series of problems with the new engine. There had also been problems with the introduction of the plane into service. The design team had expended a great deal of energy on minimizing weight. This led to some modifications to cure stress problems which had developed in the initial carrier trials of the plane. These problems were partly the result of poor landing technique. In response, Pilots were given additional practice, while the Skyraider was also strengthened to withstand heavier impacts. Most of the planes they served with in Korea were to be phased out rapidly. The jets because of the rapid developments in technology, and the piston planes because of their age. The Skyraiders' future was also already being scrutinized in order to develop specifications for a replacement aircraft. The conclusion was a tribute to the big Douglas aircraft, because the Navy decided to buy 3 aircraft, splitting the roles performed by the Skyraider to a range of airframe. In 1949, the future of the ADs could at best have been described as uncertain. Very few could have predicted they would endure long into the jet era. But orders continued, and when production eventually ceased on the 18th of February 1957, 3,180 Skyraiders had been built. It would be many more years before they would be found in museums.
When we would get back to Japan on rest and recreation, if we ever met Army people or Marines that had been on the ground up in the front lines and told them what we flew, they always said, well, you guys are the ones that saved our lives and we wouldn't have your job for anything.
Oftentimes we'd find, particularly a Vietnamese pilot who was rather short, that we'd have to put a seat cushion or a pillow behind them so we could move the Vietnamese pilot forward so that he could get full right rudder, particularly with a heavy load on a short runway where it needed full power instantly.
In September 1960, the first Skyraiders arrived in a new theater of conflict, in a new role as fighters to join the Vietnamese Air Force. In May, a further 25 arrived, where they became a major factor in the air war over Vietnam. The United States' involvement with the Vietnamese Air Force grew, not only in supplying aircraft, but helping in many ways to tune the Vietnamese into a combat-ready force. In 1962, pilot training was transferred to the United States. Military aviation experimentation was being directed toward the question, what type of aircraft would best answer the tactical requirements in counterinsurgency operations? The answer was an aircraft with the attributes of the Douglas Skyraider. U.S. involvement with the Vietnamese Air Force had formally started in 1955, but it was not until the early 60s that U.S. advisors were sent to Vietnam in noticeable numbers. American pilots supplemented the locals. American administrators, ground crew, and trainers also multiplied, and the flow of aircraft continued. Also increasing through this time was the level of insurgent activity. The flow of arms and then troops from the north made the situation in much of the south untenable. For military efforts to work, the nature of the regime would have to change, giving some recognition to the interests of the people. Sadly, Southern politics would be limited to a series of presidents. The system persisted. It eventually became defeat.
When I started out in the pilot training, I wanted to fly the A-1, terribly so, but we didn't have any left, so I took a C-123 for a one-year tour in Saigon, quickly volunteered for a concurrent tour to get into the A-1, and it worked out great. I flew the A-1 out of NKP, and towards the end of that tour...
What's NKP?
Nakhon Phanom. That's where we had our A-1 station. Towards the end of that tour, and this will bring you up to speed of us going to Utapao to get these airplanes. General Adderholt had contacted some of the A-1 people and said, I need some T-28 advisors. If y'all want to do that, I'll send you to the Defense Language Institute to study Thai for a year and then back over to work for him. I had come back and was going to work as a T-28 advisor when he introduced me to the Stoll Porter, which the Thais had just acquired, and I became an advisor for that. This year is 73, and then we had 74, and then in 75 is when South Vietnam fell. During the 73, 74 timeframe, General Adderholt was working behind the curtain, so to speak, with the ambassador in Cambodia and the one in Vietnam. We had given them, the South Vietnamese, most of our airplanes in the Vietnamization, and they had become the fourth largest air force, so over 2,000 airplanes in the world.
When they received their first Skyraiders, the Vietnamese were disappointed. They had been expecting jets. However, the Geneva Agreement outlawed the introduction of such advanced weapons into the conflict. The Vietnamese Air Force would not get its first jets, Northrop F-5s, until 1967. In the interim, they used a variety of aircraft in well-organized and effective operations against the guerrilla forces. Spotters and attack aircraft worked together closely to provide powerful and precise support to ground operations. Under the close, often hands-on guidance of the U.S. Air Force advisors, the VNAF developed tactical responses to guerrilla operations that were to remain models for much of the war. Smoke markers, fired by Cessna bird dogs operating as forward air controllers, would indicate targets for the Skyraiders. In 1962, the name of the Skyraider changed again to the A-1. The Skyraider's third official designation actually suited the plane perfectly. A-1 was certainly an accurate description. Over the skies in Vietnam, Skyraiders performed an outstanding role in counterinsurgency, and another custom, the United States Air Force was soon to be flying them alongside the Vietnamese.
My fellow Americans, as President and Commander-in-Chief, it is my duty to the American people to report that renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas and the Gulf.
President Johnson's announcement after the Gulf of Tonkin incident was not actually the first American involvement in the Vietnam conflict. President Kennedy had promoted counterinsurgency as essential, and Air Force units had grown up around this specialty. Nor had they taken long to arrive in Vietnam with its long-running guerrilla war. The entire conventional weight of the U.S. was committed in a guerrilla war. Helicopters would be the enduring image of the Vietnam, as gunships, as troop carriers, and as rescue for downed pilots.
Bravo 8-1, airborne at flight of 16, event 101-4, over.
Bravo 8-1, this is Clearwater. Roger. Your pigeons to Point Cairo, 28014, over.
Helicopters provided a focus for forces on the ground, and became a persisting symbol of the conflict. The increasing weight of war machinery and new methods of employing it developed along with a bewildering series of political skirmishes. U.S. Air Force Skyraiders had started Vietnam operations in May 1964 with Vietnamese observers who were nominally in charge of activity. The twin-seat A-1Es they used were to be the first of many U.S. Air Force Skyraiders to serve in the theater. By the time the E's began to run out, the U.S. was fully involved. They could be replaced with the still numerous single-seaters. The use of these planes alongside Mach 2 jets was not incongruous. It was a result of specialization. Skyraiders had exceptional attributes. The ground troops appreciated their heavy load of ordnance and the fact that they could loiter, waiting for work. Their pilots loved the accuracy that could be achieved when flying something as stable, slow, and maneuverable as their A-1s. They were also grateful for the armored toughness of the planes. In their long career, the Skyraiders earned several nicknames. There was a drive to have them known as the Pulverizer, which never took. They were known after their call sign in Korea as AVs, which were able dogs. They also had other names. They were Spads, and in their rescue work, they were Sandy. Their activity in close support was unmatchable. They pounded away with an accuracy impossible with supersonic aircraft. They provided this service in virtually all weather. When the jets were grounded, the Skyraiders were out there working. Admittedly, they offered a pretty good target. Someone who had been trying to hit a Mach 2 jet with the rifle would have welcomed the sight of a Spad to shoot at. But the Spad soaked up damage and kept on going, at least to the extent of getting home, even if they wouldn't fly again. The U.S. Air Force lost 153 Skyraiders in combat in Vietnam between 1962 and 1973. A further 41 were listed as operational losses. "146 of the U.S. Air Force losses were caused by ground fire.
One occasion, we had a 4-ship of A-1Es land at Nakhon Phanom, and between us 4 A-1s and the 2 helicopters, there were 619 holes in our aircraft. That's exciting. And it was immediate. And oftentimes it was dramatic, high drama over a long period of time.
There comes a time in the life of an aircraft when the next rebuild cannot be justified, and the E models had come to that point. The U.S. Air Force would continue to use Skyraiders, replacing the aging E's with the single-seat H model. The last E model flew its final mission on the 10th of April 1967. The nickname Spad referred to a First World War biplane. At first, it expressed the scorn of the jet pilots for the lumbering old war horses that cluttered their airfields. However, the Spads in Vietnam changed that scorn into grudging respect and then into awe. In time, many of the jet jockeys would owe a great deal to the Spads, because Vietnam had given the Skyraiders a new task. Many knowledgeable people maintain that the Spads found their finest hour in this new role. The rescue parties involved a variety of aircraft, control aircraft, spotters, the rescued choppers, and the pugnacious A-1s as escorts. The control aircraft would patrol at height, listening for the radio beacon of a downed pilot. After establishing the pilot's whereabouts, a rescue team would be directed to the area. Strike aircraft would also be involved in covering the operation, especially when the rescue was conducted deep inside North Vietnam. Despite the danger, the units pressed each mission as hard as possible, and in the course of the war were credited with an amazing 3,833 rescues.
Rooster Lead, this is Crown 1. We're verified your identity. Sandy's are en route. We'll arrive in your area in 8 minutes. Jolly Green's in 19 minutes. We have called MCAP for you. It should be in your area by now.
Roger, I have tally-ho the MCAP. Thank you.
Stay in orbit over Red Rooster 2 until Sandy's arrived.
Roger, Crown.
Roger, Crown. This is Sandy 1. Go ahead.
Red Rooster Lead is still orbiting over Down Pilot at coordinates 1020 north, 10550 east. He has reported enemy automatic weapon fire 1 mile north of Down Pilot. There may be a lot more around the pilot himself. Sandy 1, this is Crown. I am designating you on scene commander. Take over.
Roger, Crown. I've got it.
Skyraiders filled the role of escort well. They had the endurance to stay aloft for hours. They could quite happily hover along with the slow helicopters. At the location of a rescue, they could bring their firepower into play to suppress any hostile activity in the area, allowing the Jolly Greens to go about their business with little interference. For these missions, the Skyraiders were fully loaded with ordnance and ammunition. Because of the vulnerability of the helicopters to ground fire, it was essential that enemy activity be suppressed before the choppers presented themselves as stationary targets hovering above the downed crew. As a result, the A-1s would engage in what was referred to as trolling for fire. This consisted of flying low and deliberately drawing fire from enemy guns near the scene. When these guns had been located and silenced, the air would be safer for helicopters. It did, however, make a Skyraider a dangerous place to be. The rescue team's motto was, "That others may live." The parajumpers, the men who went down the wire to the pilot, were trained scuba divers in case the rescue took place over water. They were qualified parachutists and experts with small arms and hand-to-hand combat. They were also fully trained in first aid. With the rest of the crew, they faced the danger of flying low and slow in their chopper to the rescue site, often under intense fire. Then they left even the aircraft's limited safety to become dangling targets. That others may live.
The tremendous personal satisfaction you had out of seeing a guy step out of that helicopter was tremendous. It was a very exciting experience from a tactical standpoint. The beautiful thing about the A-1 is that it could stay over the guy for hours on time. It had a versatile load with 15 external stations. You could put a wide variety of ordnance on the aircraft. So it meant that when you got airborne, you could be applied to a wide variety of targets and situations. The disadvantage to the A-1 is obvious, because while it was an airplane with tremendous staying power and time in the air, it was very slow. And as a result, it was a fairly easy target for less sophisticated automatic weapons and anti-air.
The Navy had apparently replaced the Skyraider when it split the roles of the plane among three airplanes. The Grumman Tracker was to take over anti-submarine missions and went into service in 1954. The 1952 Douglas Skywarrior was to carry out long-range bombing, including nuclear bombing. And the Douglas Skyhawk, the superb A-4, was to do everything else. But no one had told the Skyraiders. They were still there in 1964 when the carriers found themselves in Vietnam, still a standard medium attack plane. Certainly the other types were there as well, but mingling with the screaming jets of the Phantoms, Skyhawks, and Vigilantes was the throbbing piston-engine roar of the Skyraiders. They were an important part of the striking power of the carriers in the early years of Navy involvement, and their slow and accurate attacks brought huge bomb loads to targets with deadly effect. In contrast to their jet-powered comrades, they were likely to be found on their way back to the ship, quietly looking for targets of opportunity. Their accuracy, huge loads, and long range made them uniquely valuable. But all good things come to an end. If the production lines were not to be reopened for further construction, were only the existing Skyraiders. They were getting old, not just because of their date of manufacture, but because they were being worked so hard. What happens to a plane in combat is extraordinary, and the Skyraiders were in the process of being replaced by a fourth aircraft. Although some were taken out of mothballs to be revitalized by the U.S. Air Force, the A-1s were being phased out of service, this time for real. On Sunday, the 20th of February 1968, Lieutenant Theodore Hill landed his Skyraider on the USS Coral Sea after completing a combat mission over Vietnam. He was 23 years old, and the Skyraider had been in service for 23 years. He had just completed the last combat mission of U.S. Navy Skyraiders. That was it. The whole planes had finished their Navy service. No amount of polishing could extend their lifespan. They could still have been loaded with arms and sent on more missions, but it was time to call it a day. After a career as a full-time anachronism, the Skyraider had finally earned a long overdue retirement. Their replacements were already in service. Indeed, some of their replacements were due for replacement themselves. Pilots had a love affair with their A-1s. They were disappointed that they had to give up the Spads. This was no reflection on their new planes, but there was simply no replacement for the seat of your pants plan, the ponderous but dynamic control, the stability, the leisure, the intensity of action, the accuracy and power of the Skyraiders.
Two American aviators join us today. Both flew the SPAD in Southeast Asia. John Goldenbaum is a retired United States Air Force lieutenant colonel. He served 20 years active duty, including 2 tours in Vietnam, 608 combat hours. He earned numerous decorations, including the Distinguished Flying Cross, 11 air medals, and more. John commanded the famous 71st Tactical Fighter Squadron at Langley Air Force Base. As a civilian, he continues to use aviation to connect and work with at-risk young people. Last year, here at Warbirds, John shared his Vietnam SPAD experiences and joins us today to highlight another SPAD pilot's dramatic A-1 record in skies over Southeast Asia. He is Roger Youngblood, also a retired United States Air Force officer who served 24 years active duty. He logged 4,000 flight hours in 12 different types of aircraft. He is highly decorated with 48 Air Service medals, including 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 4 Meritorious Service medals. He was a program manager and a test pilot for the A-10 F-16 Joint Program, Chief of Air Operations in Korea, and advisor to the United States Air Operations, Thailand. Roger and a fellow pilot saved 4 A-1 SPADs for history. One of those 4 planes currently airworthy in the United States is on the ramp today. Tail number 139606. Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm David Hartman, and please, oh my gosh, thank you. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Please welcome our guests, Roger Youngblood, Ken Holston, I'll introduce you to in just a moment, and Jay Goldenbaum. Jay, where are you? There's Jay down here that you just saw in the video. Gents, enjoy. So, hi, everybody. This is one of the most remarkable, dramatic stories of thousands of them, actually, from the Vietnam period. Ken Holston is an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel retired, also highly decorated, has 187 combat missions, but they were flown later in Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And Ken joins us. He flew which is 606? I can't tell. Here's 606. He flew this airplane in, so it would be here today. Ken, welcome to the trio.
Thanks, David.
Yes.
You know, the number one question we get about these airplanes and the history is, what were U.S. Air Force pilots doing flying propeller-driven, former Navy carrier-based attack airplanes in the jet age in a place called Vietnam? And to truly answer that question, you sort of have to take a step back in time and knock some rust off of some world geography and some history and go to the end of World War II, 1944-45. We'd won the war in Europe. We were taking the war to Japan and the home islands, and the B-29 Superfortress was a technological marvel of its day. And one of the key points that made that airplane possible was the development of the Wright 3350 engine. Now, the Pentagon, fearing that we would have to actually invade Japan, went to the Douglas Company, which made some superior airplanes like the DC-3 and the SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The Pentagon went to Douglas and said, hey, we love the Dauntless, but now that we have this new 3350 engine available and we might have to invade Japan.
Is that the engine, excuse me for interrupting, is that the same engine that we just heard about that was on the B-29?
Exactly. Wow. So as we weave the story together, this is essentially the same basic engine that's on the B-29. And they said to Douglas, why don't we take that engine and build a successor to the Dauntless? We'll call it the Dauntless II. Douglas did that. They built a prototype, and it flew just a few months before the atomic bombs dropped and ended the war, preventing the need for that invasion. And the war ended, of course, with the dropping of the bombs. But the Pentagon liked the airplane so much, they put it into production, but instead of calling it Dauntless II, it became the Skyraider. As World War II ended, of course, two of our allies, Russia and China, chose to follow a communist path and quickly became enemies in the start of the Cold War. And that Cold War lay dormant until the 50s started, and the heat began in a place called Korea.
And interestingly, it was similar to what happened later in Vietnam, split down the middle with North and South, just as North and South Vietnam, but it was Korea in the early 50s.
You're exactly right. Now, a map is up on the Jumbotron there on the other side of the globe. If you just want to do a quick refresher of your world geography with, you see the Japan in between Russia and China. Korea is just to the left of that, so in the same neighborhood in Asia. And the Skyraider was the primary ground attack airplane for the Navy and Marines, both flying off the ships and ground bases. Many of you may have seen a great color movie from the 50s called The Bridges at Toko-Ri. While the stars of the movie were Grumman Panther jets, that's a little bit of a Hollywoodism. The real heroes of that movie, or in the history books, were the Skyraiders that went in and actually took down those bridges. When that period of time ended, the Pentagon looked back and said, wow, we have worn out our Skyraider fleet. And while we love the silver screen version, we would love to build more jets. The truth is, jets are not ready for prime time. They couldn't carry the load. They didn't have the fuel efficiency, and the metallurgy in the engines just didn't allow the lifespan of the engine like the good old SPAD. So the SPAD was put back into production, and several hundred more were built in a production run from 54 to 57, and our 606 here is a 1955 model. Into the 60s, President Kennedy, of course, was in the White House, and one of the pillars of our foreign policy at that point, you may remember, called the domino theory. That was a concern that if communism continued to try to spread its tentacles and knock down small countries one at a time, it could set a tumbling like dominoes and allow communism to spread.
Ken, it's interesting when we get to this period with the early 60s, we talk about this war as the Vietnam War, and yet there were many more countries involved than just the two Vietnams.
That's exactly right. And on the chart up there that we had earlier, when you zoom in on the area, we call it the Vietnam War, but it was really the Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand War. President Kennedy had hoped to keep us out of direct involvement, and we think of him as the father of special forces, the Green Berets, advisors that would go in and help the indigenous folks of their own country help themselves. And lesser known is that the Air Force stood up a unit called the Air Commandos, which were sort of the equivalent of the Green Berets in the Air Force. South Vietnam had been supplied with Skyraiders as early as 1960 and became the second largest operator of A-1s in the world. And the Air Force took over from the Navy, working with the South Vietnamese in the early 60s, flying missions using the E model. That's a two-seat version of this airplane where a U.S. pilot and a Vietnamese pilot could fly together.
Where would those pilots train, the South Vietnamese pilots? I mean, as long and detailed and deep a process as that was, where would they train?
The short answer is many of them came to America and did flight training in the States and then went back to Vietnam to serve. That joint flying only lasted a couple years. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, America then took on a frontline role in Vietnam and flew the multi-place A-1E single pilot. Those airplanes were used up, and by this time, into the mid to late 60s, jet technology did catch up, and the Navy was now able to build their ship squadrons using A-4 Skyhawks, A-7 Corsair IIs, and the single-seat Skyraiders like our 606 and H model were now surplus, if you will. And the Air Force said, boy, we'll take all you'll give us. And they stood up 4 squadrons of single-seat, mostly single-seat Skyraiders.
So where would they fly out of?
Well, the 3 of the squadrons were in Thailand, and 1 was in Vietnam. The airplanes did a variety of missions, everything from forward air control, armed reconnaissance, close air support for troops, more recently declassified support of Green Beret special operations teams, and then finally the most well-known mission, the search and rescue mission where they used the call sign Sandy, went in to protect downed pilots and then protect the helicopters that went in to pick up those downed pilots. Under President Nixon and the Vietnamization program, we needed to reduce our footprint in Vietnam and began a slow withdrawal. So piecemeal remaining Skyraiders were handed over to the South Vietnamese, and by the end of 1972, we had stopped operating, Americans had stopped operating Skyraiders in South Vietnam, and the Vietnamese were fighting on their own until the fall of South Vietnam in 1975. And the last part of the story really is that many of us have seen the Discovery Channel footage that when South Vietnam fell and the tanks rolled in on the embassy in the South, in Saigon, folks clamored to escape, mostly using helicopters to fly out to the ships offshore, and the footages of the decks being cleared, helicopters being pushed over the side to make room for more. Less documented was the escape of fixed-wing airplanes. Many of them went over to Thailand, and our 606 was used by a South Vietnamese pilot.
So why were these airplanes sent over to Thailand?
Thailand provided an ideal place for the Skyraiders and the Jolly Green Rescue helicopters to base out of because of the proximity of what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Not just one trail, but really a network of thousands of paths and roadways that work down around Vietnam. And on one of the maps that you see there, you see that Vietnam is a very narrow country, and our forces in Vietnam formed what you would call a roadblock. And what do we do when you come up against a roadblock? You go around it. And therefore the war spilled over into Laos and Cambodia. And that proximity of our bases in Thailand allowed us to operate and fight what they called the secret war, stopping the flow of men and material from North Vietnam through those neighboring countries into South Vietnam.
So how many hundreds or how many airplanes were parked over there to keep them from the North Vietnamese?
I would estimate the number is probably 50 or 60. I know 11 of them were Skyraiders, and 4 of them, Roger and another pilot named Jack Drummond, were able to save.
So, Roger, there's the backgrounder on all of this, which, by the way, is one of the best brief backgrounds about the Vietnam War I've ever heard. That was awesome. Roger, yeah. You know, this is part of what we do here. We're trying to present some of this history because I guess most of you, if you were born when that was going on, you were awfully young. And so one of our goals is to not only honor veterans, which is the major reason we're here, but to try to refresh people's memories or give them some memory about who did what to make sure that we could be here today and live the lives we lead. And we honor these veterans every day in every way. So, Roger, you're up.
Thank you. And thank all of y'all for coming out here in this hot sun to listen to a little bit of history. When I started out in the pilot training, I wanted to fly the A-1, terribly so, but we didn't have any left. So I took a C-123 for a 1-year tour in Saigon. Quickly volunteered for a concurrent tour to get into the A-1, and it worked out great. I flew the A-1 out of NKP, and towards the end of that tour...
What's NKP?
Nakhon Phanom. That's where we had our A-1 station. Towards the end of that tour, and this will bring you up to speed of us going to Utapao to get these airplanes. General Adderholt had contacted some of the A-1 people and said, I need some T-28 advisors. If y'all want to do that, I'll send you to the Defense Language Institute to study Thai for a year and then back over to work for him. I had come back and was going to work as a T-28 advisor when he introduced me to the Stowe Porter, which the Thais had just acquired, and I became an advisor for that. This year is 73, and then we had 74, and then in 75 is when South Vietnam fell. During the 73, 74 timeframe, General Adderholt was working behind the curtain, so to speak, with the ambassador in Cambodia and the one in Vietnam. We had given them, the South Vietnamese, most of our airplanes in the Vietnamization, and they had become the 4th largest air force, so over 2,000 airplanes in the world. Things were going south for them, and same way with the Khmer Rouge, which was approaching into Cambodia. General Adderholt came up with a plan to get everybody out. My partner in crime, and I can't quite see the slides back there, but if they bring up Jack Drummond, he's the one that worked with me. General Adderholt had called him and called me and said, y'all had flown A-1s before. I need you to help me out. So Cambodia was about to fall, and they did fall back in early part of April. And there was about 60 or 97 airplanes came out of Cambodia, mostly T-28s, into Utapao. Now, set the stage here. You had 4 nations, 4 air forces at Utapao at one time. Once Saigon fell and the South Vietnamese Air Force came into Utapao, we had the U.S. Air Force that had B-52s still there. We had the Royal Thai Air Force. We had the Cambodian Air Force and the South Vietnamese Air Force. And nobody could hardly talk to anybody. It was a Wild West show beyond imagination. So my partner in crime was Jack Drummond. He had a great background, although not in combat in the A-1. He had one at Eglin Air Force Base. He was a weapons tester. He worked directly for General Adderholt. That was one of the reasons General Adderholt, when he went over to Southeast Asia, he took Jack Drummond with him because he trusted him. So once he had Jack Drummond in country and I was in country and Cambodia fell, he had called me and told me, he said, I need you to go down to Utapao, look things over. I'm understanding that the South Vietnamese are going to try to come out of there fairly quickly, and they did on April the 29th. Before they came out, he sent me down to a little field, and it's on one of the maps. I can't quite see them, David. But anyway, there's a small grassy strip next to Cambodia called Trat, T-R-A-T. He said, check that out because a lot of the airplanes coming out of Cambodia and South Vietnam are not going to have gas, like especially the UH-1s and the O-1s, and they're going to need to land. So I went down there. I found a 3,000, 4,000 foot strip. I checked it out. It was okay. I got back to Outer Holt and I said, you can tell them through your channels that there is a strip short of Utapao. Utapao was further to the west. So when Cambodia came out, it was kind of phenomenal. General Outer Holt designed the ops plan for them to leave. They literally loaded their T-28s in Phnom Penh with Mark 82s. And in doing so, they put all their families on a bus to go west to a place called Battambang. Once the families were there, the T-28s took off. They bombed the Khmer Rouge. They RTB'd into Battambang. They picked up their families and put them in the back seat of the T-28, loaded up again with Mark 82s, and went back out to the Khmer Rouge, bombed the Khmer Rouge, and then returned into Thailand to land. That's the way it all happened, and that was because Outer Holt lined it out for them exactly what to do. So he not only saved their families, but he did 2 strikes prior to them evacuating out to Utapao.
And the families were in the backseat of T-28s on bombing missions?
As many as a wife and 2 or 3 kids in the backseat of a T-28. The whole story of this evacuation, whether it's Cambodia or Vietnam, is unbelievable. We had A-37s landing with a pilot and 4 people in the right seat. We had C-47s designed for 30 or 40 people landing with 150 Vietnamese people in there. It was a Wild West show, believe me. So I had trots set up for them, and we were evacuating people out. And as we were getting them off the helicopters that would land, I was trying to check things out and see who was coming in and all, because we didn't know who was on the helicopters. And what was meaningful to me was there was an elderly lady got off of the helicopter. She was in her Ao Yai, Vietnamese Ao Yai. She was about, according to my interpreter, pilot, Vietnamese pilot, he went and talked to her. She was over 90 years old. And she was carrying a plastic bag in her hands wrapped up like this, and she had tied a knot in it. And most of you, or any of you that's been in Asia, know that the Asian people carry a lot of things, food and everything, in these plastic bags. Well, she had a clear plastic bag that was filled with water. I said, well, what's in there? He came back and he said she got out of Vietnam with her goldfish. So that was important. The other end of the spectrum was that a 17-year-old girl got off a helicopter with a 4-day-old baby.
Wow.
So there we were. Anyway, Jack Drummond and I knew that the South Vietnamese was coming out, and we were down there looking around, and then on the 29th of April, Saigon fell. And I don't know where the slide program is up there, but anyway, I'll just tell you how it was. When the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong overran Saigon, it was unbelievable. The South Vietnamese military was running, or Air Force was running to see if anything had any gas and just take off and go west. And so a lot of them landed on the roads. A lot of them helicopters landed in rice paddies in Thailand. Some of them made it all the way to Utapao. There was approximately 165 Vietnamese aircraft there. And those were F-5s, some of them nearly brand new, A-37s,
wow.
C-47s, AC-119s, O-1s, Hueys, etc. Well, Outer Holt's plan was, he said, we're not leaving those airplanes there. And he was the art of the deal before the art of the deal. I'm just going to tell you. He was a real trooper, and if you have the chance to read his book, it'll be time well spent. So he sent Outer Holt and I down to Utapao a little bit before the planes come out, and we were there when they were coming in. The B-52s had a 12,000-foot runway, and these planes coming in from Vietnam, they couldn't speak English. They didn't know anything other than they were needing a place to land. And we literally saw airplanes landing at both ends of the runway at the same time. C-47s coming in with an engine on fire. Another airplane landing and the gear just collapsing underneath it. Well, the SAC commander there, Colonel Austin, had a number of people there working for him, and he had them out there with trucks and tractors and all clearing the runway. So if you can imagine this place here, and all these planes here, instead of being in a row and in order, were parked all different kind of ways, some no gear, some props bent, some wings bent up. That's the way it was, and it was just unbelievable. So when Jack Drummond and I got there, after all the A-1s had landed, we went down and tried to check them out. And we found out that they were sorting the airplanes, the U.S. was, into the type of airplane that was available. They had all the A-1s together and all the AC-119s, C-130s, etc. So the morning after they got through sorting, I took Jack back down in the porter, and we said, well, where are the A1s? And so we got in a truck, and he took us way to the back of one of the runways where there was a taxiway. And in Utapao, it's very flat. It's right on the bay. So in order to build a runway and taxiways that would uphold a B-52 taxiing, they had to dig what we call in Texas some bar ditches. I mean, they had to dig some deep ditches and pound that dirt up. Well, they had parked all the A1s in a row in the ditch, backed them off the taxiway in the ditch, in the grass. 2 nights before we went down there to get them, it had started raining. And it rained every day in the monsoon. And then it was sunshine and it rained. So when Jack and I finally got out of the truck and we saw 11 A1s, they were literally underwater above the tire. So you go here and you look at the tire up about halfway on the strut. That's how deep the water was that they were sitting in. And so I told Jack, I said, you know, we don't even know if these hydraulics are going to work, the brakes are going to work or anything. So we had Chief Master Sergeant Day, and I think that was who it was. We asked him, said, can you get these things out of the water up here on the grass so we can look them over? And he said,
as far as you knew, were all of them flyable, or did you know?
Well, here was the good thing. They had just flown in. And when we got them out on the grass and we got up on the wing, started looking around, there's no checklist. There's no 781 manual talking about the condition of the airplane. The cockpits had been left open. And when I reached over into that cockpit of Nebby 606 and pressed down on the parachute seat cushion, the water came up between my fingers. So I told Jack, I said, we're not flying with this seat armed. We're leaving the pin in. So the ejection seat pin was right here at the base of the seat. So we flew those with no chance of getting out, which was fine. We left the canopies open.
Wait, that was fine?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Well, I don't know too many people that bailed out with wet silk and it opened up into a parachute. I put it that way. So we had a plan. And this was all fly by night. I hadn't flown the A1 for 3 years. Jack hadn't flown it for 5 or 6 years. So we're trying to put together in our mind the checklist of how to start the A1. And we started remembering over and over. I said, well, I remember we need to put the power on. We need to set the throttle about here for 1,000 RPM when it cranks up. We need the prop lever and the mixture lever up. And I said, we count 16 blades going across the nose. And after 16, it's pretty greased up. And we turn it on and go to both on the mags. And believe it or not, our memories were pretty close to correct. And they cranked up.
Or you wouldn't be here today.
Well, that's true. And there's a lot to that. We had gone over to base operations and told them we're going to try to get in and turn the power on and see if we can find a radio that Jack and I can talk plane to plane on. And that we were going to try to get them out of there. And one thing to note about the whole deal of 200 or 300 airplanes sitting there from 3 or 4 different countries, only 4 airplanes were flown out of Utapao to safety. The rest of them were put on trucks or slung out or whatever. Those 4 airplanes were A1s. And 606 sitting here today is one of those 4 airplanes.
Wow.
So when Jack and I finally decided we're going to give it a shot, we said, we had one E-model there, 683. And I said, well, let's get in it and let's fly around just to kind of refresh ourselves. When we got on the wings and looked in the cockpit, there was no right seat and no right stick. So that ended that conversation. So I, being a captain and him and a major, I got to fly the fat face of single seat, big one. And he got the 332, which was a single seater. We got in there and we turned on the radios and we talked and all. And we said, well, okay, let's give it a shot. And all we had done to that airplane was put oil in it and 115, 145 avgas. That was it. We walked around and walked around. We were literally looking for bullet holes or damage to the airplane that it might have happened when they were escaping from South Vietnam.
Had they dragged these airplanes out of the water yet?
Yeah, they dragged them up on the grass, and we looked around, and, you know, what can you say? The water drained out of the wheels and the brakes, and we were going to give it a shot no matter what. When Adderholt asks you to do something, you don't argue with that man. When he initially called me about flying the A1, I said, yes, sir, I'll do that. I said, you know, it's been 3 years. And he just said, Youngblood, you ever drive a bicycle? I said, yes, sir. Think you can do it again? I said, yes, sir. He said, get your ass down there and get them A1s. And that was the whole story, believe it or not.
That's leadership.
Well, I'm telling you, you go with that man anywhere. So we had walked around and pre-flighted as best we could. What we soon learned was there was no de-arming at the end of the runway when the Vietnamese landed. The guns were still hot. So I told Jack, keep your finger off the trigger. You know, it's an unbelievable situation to sit in an airplane you haven't flown for 3 years and crank it up and say, I'm going to just take it up and have some fun here. Well, it was unbelievable. But anyway, we told the tower we were going to taxi out that morning with 683 and 332. And we cranked them up, and we chose the call signs Sandy 1 and Sandy 2. And just would have it, as we got out on the taxiway and turned and we started taxiing towards the parallel taxiway, there was 2 Jolly Greens sitting over there waiting to rescue people with their engines running. So here, after all these years, was 2 A-1s taxiing past 2 Jolly Greens, which was a little emotional.
Wow.
So we got to the end of the runway to arm, and we were going to take off north to south over the ocean just in case the engine quit or whatever. We could just ditch it in the ocean and try to get out. We had T-28 harnesses, but the coke fittings fit the harnesses in the A-1. So we did that, and then we locked the seats and locked the harness so we couldn't fall forward, but the seat pin was in, so there was no ejecting like I told you. So we got onto the runway, and I told Jack, I said, Jack, if you have to abort, just let it drive off of the end of the runway. If you get on the brakes and one of them hangs up, you're going to cartwheel, and we don't know what'll happen. So we agreed to that, and we didn't maximize the power on takeoff. They were clean birds, and so we got up at a adequate.
Did you take off individually or together?
Yeah, Jack took off first, and so I was behind him, and I was looking at his airplane and kind of talking to him. He had selected half flaps on takeoff, and he got down about 2,000 foot, and he said, no flaps, because it was coming on up and ready to roll. So he popped his flaps up, and I raised mine too. And about 3,000 foot or so, you could see him start to just touch a little left, right, and then all of a sudden he was airborne. And we were going to make for sure that we got up a little ways before he sucked the gear up, and he popped the gear, and I said, the gear clean good, buddy, the gear clean good. So when he took off, we were going to exit back to the east over outside of Utapao and head up to Tak Lee. And he made a giant turn to the right to give me time. And I was going down, and I told him, I'm off. And I said, gear up. And so then he started his turn back to the left, and I joined up on his echelon to the left, and we turned out, and we flew at 1,000 feet. Some of the pictures are on these slides. I don't know where that show is. But I was up on his wing about 500 foot above him, taking pictures of him flying that Vietnamese A-1 332 up to Tak Lee. Now, Adderholt had told us to take the airplanes to Tak Lee. And the reason being was there was a huge hangar that he had built himself or had built up there. And this is nothing confidential. I mean, it was to hide U-2s in there. If the U-2s had an engine problem and had to emergency land, they could land at Tak Lee and they could put them in a hangar. So he said, I want you to put those A-1s in that hangar. So there's a slide here in a minute to show that we landed in the first H model 332. We turned over to the Thai colonel there at the base. And we just came down initial, just like we owned the place. We pitched out. We land Sandy 1 on final and Sandy 2 on final, and we touched down, taxied in, turned the keys over to that Thai colonel, and Adderholt had directed that an Army fixed-wing aircraft come up to Tak Lee and pick us up and take us back down to Utapao. So we got on that fixed-wing Army plane, and we were headed back to Utapao, and we're sitting up close to the bulkhead, and that Army captain flying in the left seat, he leaned back and he said, man, it's the first time I ever heard, and he was following us on the radio. He said, it's the first time I ever heard 2 pilots talking over the radio how to fly the airplane as they were flying the airplane. So, and we did the whole way up there. We said, well, we know we need to do this. We'll hold this much on final. We'll, you know, and in those days, I tell some of my best friends like Ken, carry a little extra on final for the family, and you'll never regret it. It's hard to get when you need it if you can't get it. So anyway, they took us back down to Utapao, and it was getting late in the evening, and the master sergeant had fueled the rest of the airplanes, the 7, and he said they're ready to go. And I said, well, if we have a problem cranking and getting airborne, I said, it's going to be close to dark when we get up to Tak Lee. I said, we'll get it next thing in the morning. So we came out the next morning and we were standing there next to 665, which now lives in Sevierville, Tennessee, at the Tennessee Air Museum, and 606, which was mine, which is right here. And it's at Kavanaugh. And I think Mr. Jim Kavanaugh's in the crowd, and I'd like to thank you very much.
Jim, are you here? Where's Jim? There he is, sir.
A lot of time and effort and money went into getting 606 back to where it is today. And thanks to Ken Holston and him being a captain with Delta Airlines, he finagled Delta to repaint 606 back to its original spec. So that's good. You've got an authentic A-1 Skyraider in 606.
Wow.
So when we got out to the last two aircraft, 665 and 606, there comes this blue staff car screaming down the taxiway to where we were located. The door slings open, and this lieutenant colonel gets out, and he's from SAC. And so, you know, they do everything by the book, whether it's going to the restroom or whatever, it's by the book. So he comes up to us and he said, wait a minute. He said, I got a call from headquarters, and they said, they heard you flew these airplanes. They want to know, when did you get current? You can't fly these airplanes. When did you get current in these A1s? And Jack and I looked at each other and looked back at him and said, yesterday. He didn't say a word. He got back in his car and headed out. So we just got in those A1s. And
how many of you active duty were in SAC? Any of you? Yeah, a few.
Nothing against SAC, but that's the way they operate.
Well, I just want to identify my old gang. So.
Yeah. And by the way, I know there's some people here visiting today that worked on the A-1, whether you were weapons troops, gas troops, whatever you were, radio. Would you raise your hand? I'd like to thank you.
Yeah. Also, Roger, would you identify John Goldenbaum's over here?
Yeah.
Two of your
this is
Sandy guys.
This is a little unusual. Maybe the first time since we came back from Vietnam. When you go into the A-1 squadron, you fly on the wing for a couple of flights, and then you're okay to go up and be Hobo 1, they call it. You lead a flight of 2. After you fly Hobo missions for a while, they upgrade you to Sandy Wingman, whether it's Sandy 4 or Sandy 2. And after you've flown a few Sandy missions and they got a lot of faith in you, they upgrade you to Sandy 1. Sandy 1 is in charge of the whole SAR force, all the Sandys, the Jollies, the forward air controllers. He communicates with the AC-130, Kingbird. I mean, he is in charge of the SAR force. It just so happened that John Goldenbaum, John Ralston, and Cliff Groves and I were in the same flight, and we were all Sandy 1s, qualified flight leads. I'd like these guys to stand up.
Yeah.
Stand up. There you go. Hey, how are you? Good to see you. It was really an honor for you to fly the SPAD and go and pick people up. That was just the greatest. So when we got 685 and 606 off, and we landed at Tok Lee, we pitched out again and landed. And as I saw Goldie rolling out on the runway, I just jokingly said to him, "Are you down?" He said, "Yeah, I just landed and I'm turning base." And I said, "Well, I guess that makes me flying the last A-1 in the U.S. Air Force." And I was on base turn. That was a joke. But I do enjoy it so much. And when we came out of there, the State Department had found out what we had done. And they said, you cannot say that you stole those airplanes from the North Vietnamese. You can say that you repositioned previously U.S.-owned property. So that's the way that was. And they gave Adderholt a hard time. And while Adderholt was running the show, he stole every F-5, every A-37. He took a bread truck with his crew of people with a settling torch and went up and down the line. He cut the guns out of the AC-119 gunships. He cut the dash out of a lot of airplanes that he couldn't do anything with. So if the North Vietnamese were coming to claim their spoils, they were going to get junk. They didn't get jack, except a bunch of wore out, broke airplanes. So Adderholt was just unbelievable. So, and kind of winding it up, when I got through with my tour in 75, he called me in his office and he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I don't know anything but close air support." And he said, "Well, how about an A-7? And they were kind of coming online. And I said, "Sir, that'd be great." So he got me an A-7 to Davis-Monthan. After the A-7, I moved to Myrtle Beach in the A-7. Then I transitioned to the A-10. So I've just been attack below 5,000 foot all my life. And I just enjoyed that. Was in 24 years, and I don't regret a second of it, especially flying 606. When I got back in 75, for some reason, I was at Eglin Air Force Base doing something. And I'd heard that all the refugees, a lot of them had been relocated to Eglin. They were out on the grass in these 50-man Army tents. And I went over there, and I'm not sure why. But I went over there to see those guys that had come back. So I asked, do you have these Vietnamese refugees segregated by aircraft? And they said yes. And so I said, well, where are the A-1 pilots? And they gave me a tent number, and there was a lot of tents. So I went down there to that tent. I walked in, and here's about 30 or 40 cots in that tent. It's hot. In typical fashion for Asian pilots and all, they're in their underwear and t-shirt. They're playing cards on their cots. That's all they had. So I sat in there and talked to them a little bit. I said, I flew the A-1 in Saigon for a while, or not in Saigon, but I saw your A-1 in Saigon. Then I got to fly the A-1, and then I was involved in you getting out of Vietnam. And so the next day I went back and I said, what do I need to do to take one of these guys with me? And that lady sitting there, she turned this piece of paper around and said, sign here. That was about what it took. So I signed off on possibly doing that. So I went to the tent and I found this one that I liked. This guy I was talking to. I said, you don't know me. I don't know you. But we both flew the A-1. If you want to get out of here, I'll take you with me to live with me. He talked to his buddies. So, okay, I'll go. So I took him in the car. We went straight to the BX. I got a cart and the biggest suitcase. We loaded up, and we headed across country to Tucson, Arizona, where he lived with me for a year. I got him a job at HEB, stocking shelves. Got him a checking account, Bank of America. Got him enrolled in an English class. After a year, he and some of his buds wanted to head out. I said, okay. I blessed them. They had bought a car. We went to the bank, got all his money out, got him traveler's checks, shook his hand, and he headed out. And that kind of summed up my tour and my career and what I wanted to do.
Wow. Were you able to keep track of him? Did you keep track of him at all, or he?
I tried to track him down a few times. I'd heard that, believe it or not, he went to Minnesota, and I think there's a lot of Vietnamese people in Minnesota, and he's probably 40 years plus now, so he's well on his way doing something. But this whole thing happened 40-something years ago, and 5 and 6 May 1975. And probably this story wouldn't have come about had the Smithsonian Air and Space Magazine not published a story about the fall of Saigon. It was labeled Escape to Utapao. You can Google it. And it told the whole story about how it all happened, except some of the minor details I told you about were left out, about Jack and I. So I got the phone calls and they said, well, where are those airplanes? And tell us what happened and all this. We didn't know anything. So this is 40 plus years. So I started checking around, and thanks to Ken Holston, he called me one day and he said, Youngblood, there's only 3 Jack Drummonds in the United States. And I didn't know where Jack had gone. And he said, guess what? One of them's in Round Rock, Texas. Well, Round Rock, Texas is 40 miles from my home. So I called him up, and believe you me, when he answered the phone, I knew I had the right number. And he said, hello. And I said, Jack. And he said, Youngblood. And that was pretty much it. So after 40 years, we got back together. Now, he had severe diabetes, and he was confined to a wheelchair. But thanks to Mr. Cavanaugh and the Cavanaugh Flight Museum in 2018, they did a weekend show about the 606, and there are other E-models there, and it's a great place. If you ever get to Texas around Dallas, go to the Cavanaugh Flight Museum and visit. It was well worth your time. So we had this show. Jack, in his wheelchair with diabetes, rented a van and drove 3.5 hours from Round Rock to Dallas to sit in the hangar, and we could tell the story one time about how we got those airplanes out of there. And then he drove back, and in late 2018, his dialysis machine failed him, and he went into hospice, and he passed. So the Adderholt is gone. Charlie Day is gone. Drummond's gone. And I'm it, and I'm not looking to leave. So that's it.
Ken? All of this was happening when you were in grade school. What is it like for you to sit here and know him and work with him now, fly this airplane? What's this experience like for you?
That is hard to put into words. You know, I built models of Skyraiders as a boy. I read about these guys, and now to be friends with them and to share in this history, it's really hard to put into words. The airplane is just a joy to fly, and to get to know someone like Roger and Goldie and Cliff, to know the history that you're carrying with you. I made the analogy, and not to be too touchy-feely, but you're flying the airplane and you just feel like you have hundreds of eyes looking over your shoulder because you're carrying. If this airplane could talk, you know, the missions it flew, the people it saved, and I'm sure there were certainly heartbreak missions where things didn't work, and that's war. But to be able to honor the Vietnam veterans now, their recognition's a little overdue, and the fact that we're able to show the airplane in its original colors, tell the story, and have Roger here tell it from the horse's mouth, it's history. If we don't remember our history, we're doomed to repeat it.
Amen. And once again, here is Roger and his colleagues and thousands, tens of thousands, over a couple of hundred years, millions of Americans have put their lives on the line so we could be here and live the way we do today. So gratitude to all of you, gentlemen. And ladies.
Thank you.
So Sam Bass, who's a 50-year safe flyer with his tens of thousands of hours. And by the way, Ken has almost 20,000 hours too, as a pilot. Sam's going to talk with these guys about the airplane. John, thank you for being with us there. John
Cliff.
Columba.
John Ralston.
Sam, take over.
Yes, sir.
Hello, we're here. Tell us a little bit about the design of the airplane. What was its purpose when it was designed?
Well, as we alluded to earlier in the presentation, at one point we thought we were going to have to invade the homelands of Japan. And so the airplane was designed to replace the Dauntless dive bomber. And the Skyraider, and I think the Bearcat, both to me are the pinnacle of the World War II technology. People that know antique airplanes know that the gear handles aren't always in good spots and whatnot. There's no ergonomics. But this airplane has a lot of ergonomics. They actually sent Douglas representatives out in the Pacific and asked pilots and mechanics, what do we need to do with this next new airplane to make it user-friendly and pilot-friendly?
Well, what is the hours when we're talking about range, not in distance, but in hours loitering range, for instance?
The internal fuel on the airplane is 380 gallons. And if you just want to use a round number of 100 gallons an hour, that's 3.8 hours to flame out on internal fuel. And then these drop tanks that you see here are each 150 gallons, so that you can add increments in range. You know, the airplane empty is about 12,500 pounds, but the gross is 25,000 pounds. So it, in essence, can carry its own weight in stuff, which you can divvy up between ordnance and fuel. So it not uncommon for missions in Vietnam to go out to the 8-hour mark if need be.
Well, speaking of armament, what is the armament on this airplane? Of course, I'm sure it varies depending on its mission. But what's typical armament for it?
In Vietnam, of course, the 420 millimeter cannons in the wings, and they typically carried also a 7.62 minigun, which show you a replica here on the stub pylon. They also carried a lot of cluster munitions, which are the kind of the equivalent of grenades, all packed into dispensers, white phosphorus bombs, rockets for both marking and high explosives. And then, of course, it could carry hard bombs, napalm, mines, rescue kits. The beauty of the airplane is if it would hang on there, it could carry it.
Well, of all of these that are built, how many do you think are still flying?
The number is less than 20. I don't recall the exact, but there are less than 20 flying. Of the H model here, only 2 fly in the world, and it's thanks to Roger Youngblood that the airplanes were saved. The J model, which was the last version, none fly.
Okay, how about flying the airplane? Now, of all the airplanes you've flown, you've got a vast knowledge here of airplanes you've flown in the Air Force and in the airlines. How does this compare?
I'd love flying this airplane. It's such an honest, stable machine. Back in the day with the high octane fuels, the manifold pressure was limited at 56 inches. Today with 100 octane, we're limited to 49, and we applied a across the board limit, actually of 45 just for engine longevity. However, we fly the airplane with no armor and no armament. So I think the way it handles on reduced power and reduced weight is probably somewhat similar to what it was like in combat. Very stable, very well harmonized. Amazing what the designers did. We're here, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, all done with slide rules. And again, what an amazing thing that the engineering minds of America did. They decided to put hydraulic assist ailerons in, but manual elevator and rudder, yet the whole airplane just feels just easy and naturally harmonized.
Well, thanks to the Kavanaugh Museum, now you get to fly this around the country. You as an individual, what does it mean to you to be able to present this to the public?
It's a lot. As a quick aside, when we decided to repaint the airplane and put it in its accurate colors, I went in search of experts, with the quotation marks, experts to help me confirm the fonts of the stencils and all this other stuff. And I found out that there really weren't any. So what they say, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And I became the Skyraider expert on that. So to be able to be a conduit to history, to get to know Roger personally, and to be able to help relate the stories, share it with the public, and in particular because Vietnam, America wanted to put all things Vietnam behind it. And in the years since Desert Storm, we've done such a better job of embracing the Vietnam veterans and the Vietnam era to make sure that as citizens, we don't forget the price of freedom.